going on. Too much to know. You can't keep track of it all.
5th January 2022.
I started taking the memory enhancers 6 months ago. I had to. If I want to change jobs, I'm going to be competing with people who know all this stuff already. They certainly make it easier to learn, to a degree. To remember, anyway. What's difficult is making sense of it all. Makes you realize how much you normally forget and why. But on the other hand, last Tuesday, meeting Alice for the first time. That's something I don't think I'm ever going to want to forget.
Without artificial aids, the human memory discards 85% of its data within a month. Almost everything a person experiences is forgotten within a few weeks. At the end of the 20th century, this limitation began to be acutely felt in some areas of society, as humankind experienced a bombardment of information unprecedented since the beginning of history. The 7 years up to 1997 saw more telephone traffic than the entire 20th century. 1,000 books were published daily, and nearly 20 million words of technical information were recorded every day. Not only did the amount of information present a problem for human memory, but the daily bombardment of data soon began to exceed humankind's ability to assimilate and make sense of it, leading to a phenomenon known as information anxiety, concern about the growing gap between information and how it was to be used.
Alice's friend Jan is going to have some problems. She's got important tests coming up in a couple of months, but she's stopped taking the memory enhancers because there's things she wants to forget. If she'd bought one of the new memory chips, she could just erase it selectively, of course, but it's not bad stuff necessarily, but, she started going out with someone new and wants to forget all the times with her ex. And it would be good if she could, not least because that guy was me.
The 1990s saw a growing level of research into how the human brain functions. The study of the relationship between chemicals in the brain and memory had already led to prescription drugs which were beginning to influence patients suffering from brain disorders. But more advanced memory-enhancing drugs were also in development, which, by turning short-term memory into long-term memory, could lead to increased concentration and alertness and better mental performance. In the field of technology, miniature computers worn as fashion accessories but serving as memory aids were already being market tested. But a more radical technological approach was also under consideration. Research suggested that it might be possible to link the human brain directly to a computer, and some scientists began to envisage implanting a memory chip inside the brain. This would not only provide access to additional information, but also had the potential to record sensory data, memories, which could be replayed or even shared.
The really odd thing with memory enhancement is that the past doesn't give up, doesn't fade away. It just hangs on in there, crowding out the present. And time goes weird too, because you don't forget. It's like everything happened yesterday. Well, I could start wiping stuff, I suppose, but what? And what would that do to me? The question is, who would I become?
Who will we become? Let's start with drugs, which, as the film said, the drugs that improve memory and make the mind work better are already starting to be developed. But Susan, you're a neuroscientist. Will they necessarily make us better people?
Well, I think it's important to bear in mind that we've had drugs with us for a long time. People have taken drugs for many centuries. At the moment, drugs can arouse you. Caffeine and nicotine do that, and therefore you can go for longer or you can concentrate more easily. And I think it's very important to distinguish between a general arousing function, which can be very valuable, and something very selective, which could not only target a particular chemical, but also a particular brain region as well as a particular chemical, because your brain isn't just a seething mass of chemicals. Those chemicals are exquisitely organized and orchestrated in different brain regions.
But if it made you more hyperactive, you needed less sleep, you could retain more memory, would that necessarily make you better?
Well, we already have those tools available to us, and I don't think people would claim they were necessarily better. On the other hand, what is the interesting issue is it might be there's an increasing emphasis in new societies for the high achiever. Already we're going that way. The people that need very little sleep are applauded. whereas perhaps in the old days they were not.
But Peter, you're a bleeding heart egalitarian. If you've got these drugs, no, but you know what I mean. If you have these drugs available, then everybody could be a high flyer. Everybody could work harder, could work more effectively. I mean, surely that's good, isn't it?
Well, I mean, in the sense that it gets away from the kind of Darwinian idea of survival of the fittest, I suppose I find it attractive. And as one who used to be terribly jealous at school of people who had photographic memories and did terribly well in exams, I mean, yes, I mean, I see it as quite positive from that point of view. I suppose my kind of worry really would be about the kind of application of it and whether we would become a society. I mean, those people with photographic memories at the end of the day, they couldn't kind of, they weren't great at digesting the information and churning it out again. They'd all kind of get 3 A's, go to university and be useless at kind of thinking through facts and information. So yes, we can prompt all these thoughts, but I just wonder how exactly we apply that sort of wisdom rather more than information.
And is there a concern about tampering with the mind in some way, from your point of view?
I sort of believe to a certain extent that we're not as we are completely by accident. There was some sort of plan. If one wants to look at it in religious terms, that we're sort of God-made rather than sort of accidentally made, and one has to be wary of tampering with the mind in that sense.
I mean, actually, a point you made, Susan, but Rosalind, you're a psychologist. I mean, your job has been, at least partly, to tamper with people's minds.
It's an artificially created market, this one. It's based on making ordinary people feel anxious about their performance and wanting to compete with people they perceive as high flyers. I can't help remembering vaginal deodorants that made everybody feel dreadfully anxious about themselves.
Finish the point.
And it was based purely on feeding anxieties that individuals have about themselves and feeling that they can supply it through something they can buy rather than something they can be. And human nature doesn't change. You can give people all the most implants in the world, and they're not all going to be high flyers.
But surely, Rosalind, if you're going, we're talking here about improving your memory, so you're kind of better at school, better in exams, and that's rather different from vaginal deodorants, isn't
The
it?
mistake here in assuming that if you improve people's memory, they'll be better at anything. All they'll be better at is remembering what they could remember.
Exactly. Hang on a second, Susan. Exactly. The one distinction that Michael Marshall Smith didn't seem to be making was that there is a difference between facts, data, knowledge, intelligence, and wisdom. Aren't there, John? I mean, it isn't just a matter of digital facts.
It's a very important one. For my money, it's the difference between data and information. And if you look at any classical definition of what information is, it's the ability to answer a question. What that definition takes for granted is what the questions are. That's what these new techniques won't help us get, is asking the right questions. Once we get that, we'll have lots of information, data to try to work on.
Can I turn that on its head and say, if you've got more actual facts, if you've got more data, does it make it more difficult rather than less difficult to make sense out of things?
No, I don't think so. I think it simply means, I mean, let's face it, the pub quiz night is going to be a thing of history. We're all going to have all the facts at our fingertips.
I don't think it is. And I also think the question is not simply answering the question, it's answering it meaningfully. And you talk about information, and he talked about sense. What we need is understanding. And understanding proceeds from the ability to make connections, not from the ability to remember things. If you know that Shakespeare was born in 1564, it doesn't help you to know anything about his play.
I mean, if I remember certain details, certain factual bits of information, and sometimes a fact might be a tune or a song, whatever it happens to be, it only means anything to me because I remember a smell that went with it, a feeling that went with it, a sensation.
When you say it means something, what do you mean by means?
It has a context.
Well, then it has a context, yes, then it makes sense.
We cannot even assume there's such a thing as a raw fact. I mean, every single individual human being has their own idea of what a fact is. You talk about remembering a tune. You may remember it as a lovely one. I may think, God, her taste in music.
But it's my fact.
It's your fact. And all fact is subjective.
So
there is no such thing as objective fact.
Yes, there is. The word for table in French is an objective fact.
But it isn't, because I may have associations.
You have certain
with
associations,
that.
but the thing is, the fact itself is an objective thing.
I
could download that onto a computer, couldn't I?
Outside a subject
Table for
human
French.
context.
Peter, hold on a second. Peter, do you think there's a wider danger in all this, that we're actually moving towards some sort of pharmacological future, where you pop pills either for information or indeed to change mood and all that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, one of the...
And what's wrong with that?
Well, one of the kind of the horrors to my mind that it raises is the idea that the kind of person who does well at school is the person who pops the most pills. But I think what's more interesting when we're talking about fact and listening to Susan, who's a scientist, is it seems to me that science can deal with facts. And I think it was Galileo, kind of years and years ago, or centuries and centuries ago, who said there were primary things and secondary things. Primary things were facts and things that you could measure that were there, and secondary things were things like emotion. And it seems that here science is trying to get into the field of emotions and artificially create them in a way, and we'll end up with, I mean, you can buy a bag of kind of roast chicken crisps and it tastes a bit like chicken, but it's artificial because you're artificially manufacturing a taste and a smell and a feeling.
John?
No, I mean, what I see as I understand what these things are doing is they're just helping us imprint facts on our experiences more on our brain. So instead of 85% of what we experience going out, maybe 60% goes out. That means that we can bring more to mind when we want to bring it to mind, but it doesn't mean that it's there in our attention all the time anyway. We simply have bigger data banks.
We should pay a little more attention to what the film said about forgetting. Forgetting is such a healthy thing.
Absolutely.
You know, here's the girlfriend of his wife who is about to expunge the memories of the rotten boyfriend. That means she's going to make the same mistake again. Experience is about learning from facts.
And forgetting's about healing.
Sheila, have you
Sheila,
got things in your life that that you would dearly like to forget?
I'm not telling you.
Glad that you have forgotten.
I'm not telling you, but I've remembered them, unfortunately. No, I haven't forgotten them, unfortunately. But I mean, remember, in lots of literature, one of the great dispensations that was given to people was the power to forget. And it may not be that the 85% that we forget is information that there's any purpose in remembering. And equally,
forgetting and ignoring.
But equally what happens is that if you do apparently forget things, which in our terms at the moment might be the same as ignoring, there are any number of things that might trigger it. And that may be when it's a valuable thing to have in your head, and it's there somewhere, but it's triggered only when it's relevant, and that seems to me to be more important.
I think there's such a reverence in the film for memory without even understanding what that means for most people, and such a reverence for information. When 90%, I mean, he talks about all these phone calls. Most phone calls that we all make are complete rubbish, let's be honest. You just ring up your friend to gripe about something.
But Susan, aren't our brains entirely full of trivia about who
something I
Paula
really
Yates
must say
is
first,
going
before
out
we
with?
all go on, is there something very important, because everyone's making such a big issue of facts versus episodes. Now, this has been acknowledged by neuroscientists for a long time in terms of so-called episodic memory, which is remembering going down to Bournemouth with Auntie Flo, particular time and place, or a fact like the word for table in French.
Galileo,
and again, there's a further type of memory which we all have, which we've been ascribing to the future, which is the ability to download, if you like, away from our conscious memories to free up our minds for marvelous thoughts. For example, riding a bicycle, driving a car, playing the piano. All these things we know are taken over by the autopilot of the brain, little brain on the back, freeing up your conscious mind to do other things while you're driving, while you're playing the piano, and so on. So these distinctions that you're making, nature's already made to a certain extent.
Isn't this the great difficulty about these? How do you select what memories you should keep and what you shouldn't?
The really critical thing that underpins this particular debate is not what's happening, but why it's happening. What is the intention that lies behind the drive to find these kind of drugs? And it's simply, with all respect to Susan, is not the same as people smoking or taking or using using caffeine. These are done for all sorts of purposes, one of which might be to keep you fresh. But that's a very different thing from a group of people out there saying, let's look for a strategy by which we can do certain things. Now, if it's to help people who are dysfunctional because they're suffering from Alzheimer's, let's say, then that's one thing, because that allows people to play a role in their own community again. If it's to help the high flyers to get even higher, then I think we have to ask what's the intention behind this and why are we doing it?
But John, what do you think the drive behind all this is, apart from helping people with Alzheimer's and so on?
Well, I mean, we're all information workers. We work in an economy of ideas. We simply try to make ourselves more fit in that economy. I exercise to try to make myself more fit, in my body. And the same arguments that would apply against me exercising my mind would also apply against me exercising my body.
And you wouldn't mind popping pills in order to do that?
No.
That's not exercising your mind, though, is it? That's just an artificial kind of stimulant to your mind.
Peter,
What's the difference between eating right and giving my mind
taking
more
vitamins
of the
or
materials
something
that
like
make
this.
memories.
Well, one of the
Taking
reasons is actually we actually have reason to believe that vitamins don't do you any harm. What about, do we know the side effects?
That's
of
a
these
separate
things?
issue.
Yes,
No, it's not.
It's whether you take it, whether you take it because you want to stay yourself,
which has
or whether
terrible
you take
side
it,
effects.
or whether you take
So
it.
you wouldn't pop pills to
Side
do
effects.
this?
Well, I'd be slightly tempted if I was still a schoolboy swatting for my exams, but let's be honest. But I think in general, no.
And you wouldn't for ethical reasons?
Well, we don't need it, you see, is the problem.
You would put it on the same category as vaginal deodorants and not take
I
it, or
think
not?
it's like the teenager's question on her first date, how far do you go?
And you wouldn't go that far?
No.
Okay. We've been talking about drugs, but what about the next leap? Maybe only 30 years away is a memory chip which can record everything we experience. Chips that could be exchanged or even traded.
Well, it took 2 years of saving, but I finally went out and got myself a new skills chip today. With that and the extra memory, I should be able to get an even better job pretty soon, assuming I can understand it all and get used to it. There's a lot of stuff in here now that I'm pretty sure didn't happen to me. Doesn't really matter, I suppose, as long as I can get paid. Actually, I had a little bit of money left over, so I bought this, a present for Alice. Carpentry skills. She's always said, well, actually she said 57 times to be precise, that she'd like to make her own furniture, so now she can. Something strange though. The other night I was bored, and so I played back off disc the first evening when Alice and I met. It was all there in perfect detail, but it wasn't how I remembered it.
He's put his finger on a real problem here. Are our lives merely the sum of things that happen to us that we can record digitally, or is there some sort of emotional content to our experience and our memory, Peter?
I think it's difficult. I've in the past written biographies of different people, and I think there history has a way of kind of reinterpreting things, and we may see things in one sense, as the guy in the film was talking about. He remembers his evening in one way. It's now dealt with in a different way, and perhaps history may regard it in a different way again. And I suppose what would worry me here is the idea of things being set in stone. So in the chip, this kind of piece of memory be put there. So say someone like Jesus would go down as a kind of first century prophet, and there'd be no attempt to sort of reevaluate that or update it, or perhaps there would, I don't know. Perhaps every 50 years they get that chip out and say, so what do we think of that idea now? We'll key that bit of information back into the chip and move onwards. So there's no room for revisionism there.
But revision, Sheila, isn't that another way of saying that there is an intrinsic value in distortion rather than truth?
I think the point that was being made in the film is more worrying than that, and that is not whether or not you can rewrite history, but whether or not you have to reinvent yourself all the time. Because you are such a complex mixture of so many things that ultimately I don't particularly want to be as predictable as, and if somebody ever is stupid enough to write my biography, and you're welcome to, then I don't really mind if you get it wrong.
Whose benefit is it for? Yeah. Who is going to make money out of this?
Well,
I mean, the money theme came out very clearly in the film. The money theme came out in terms of how he was going to get the money to buy it, and that he was going to get this extra skills chip to enhance his attractiveness to an employer. The problem with memory is that people only remember what they already know, which means that we are likely to reinforce existing structures which will do nothing for inequalities of race, sex or class. Will simply be going on repeating and not learning from human experience.
But what's wrong with actually buying things? You can buy one of these Scion things or one of these pocket computers now. I mean,
my
what's the
problem with
difference?
these chip things is who programmed the computer. I don't want anything in my brain that was programmed by some lad with acne who spends most of his time watching the Playboy
John,
channel.
you have no acne at all, but at least from this distance. but the makeup's excellent. But to what extent the other point, the more serious point that Rosalind was making, is a true one, isn't it? Isn't this going to depress creativity? It's going to reinforce the status quo. It's going to prevent humanity from moving on in really important ways.
No, I mean, this is Oxford on a chip. There isn't the matter of being able to afford 3 years at university. You can condense a lot of that experience. Interesting questions over how much, in the difference between experience and data that we were talking about earlier. But you can condense that, make it more portable, make it more egalitarian, spread it to everybody.
Well,
Sounds good.
egalitarian if people can't afford to pay for it.
Susan, the
people
basic
can afford
idea
education
that
now.
was posited in that film is that you can store a whole lifetime's experience and then trade it. Who would you like bolted on the back of your brain? Madonna or Einstein?
Well, I think you have to be careful not to confuse the facts. So if we went to Brighton both for the day, we did exactly the same things. We had the same ice cream, we saw the same people, we saw the same views. We would have different memories of them. Now, with that caveat of saying, what events would I like in my life, doesn't mean say what memories I'll have, or what experiences I'll have, what events would I like. Then I could think of something like Nelson or Leonardo da Vinci, or a number of exciting people, Elizabeth I, if we were after role models. Yeah. That doesn't mean to say, just because I inherited the events, or these events or facts were placed in my mind, they would be as simple as going with Michael Buerk to Eastbourne. It would be as simple as that. It wouldn't necessarily bring with it the sensations.
Hang on a second. You would want edited versions of that person. I mean, you could have the whole life. You could have Trafalgar and Emma Hamilton.
You could have endless facts, but that doesn't mean to say, and this is why I think we shouldn't get too excited, even if we do have memory chips. As John said, all they are is an extension of how we use the internet, how we use computers nowadays. A fact is a fact is a fact.
Psychologically vulnerable. The people who are psychologically vulnerable, who are vulnerable through the fact their husband has just left them or whatever. The wannabes, you know, they're going to buy the Madonna
TV, but doesn't the TV do that in it? Exactly.
But Peter,
the wannabes watching Dallas or something.
But they cannot then buy something which makes them think they're Madonna and they're going to be millionaires and show their backside.
But hang on a second, we're actually talking about a world where there'll be no secrets.
Well, there is a concept of privacy from oneself. And it is the ability of certain things to pop up in our minds uncalled for, which is one of the great moral agents. You are about to do something, and we've all done these things that you sort of feel you shouldn't do. You override those controls, you reach out your hand to do whatever it is, and something pops up which reminds you. Now, if memory is only to be played at will, then we will never have those essential, innate moral imperatives which help us to be better people.
John, you're the expert on all this. How would this actually work? In the film, he talked about going off, he got a little bit of change left, and he bought this microchip of carpentry skills. Now, would this actually work this way? Because although you might know in your mind what you ought to do, that doesn't necessarily mean that your hands would have the dexterity and the skills. Is there actually a fundamental difference here?
I can see two ways that this might work. One way is, it's like plugging a book into your brain. Instead of moving your eyes along the page, you can simply think and access words that tell you how to do something, that might talk you through a complicated procedure. What it's not going to do, though, in that instance, is give you the ability to do it. If I have the experience of Paul Gascoigne scoring a winning goal for England, that suddenly doesn't mean I'm going to be able to flip the ball over my shoulder, turn and fire it into the upper left-hand corner, because my body isn't wired up that way. Instead of feeding me facts from which I make decisions, I increasingly think that we can delegate to the computer decisions. It'd be, again, like a calculator wired into your brain.
This is precisely what you're worried about.
Well, it's, you know, all you're describing to me is something that I certainly wouldn't buy. This is a combination of being totally de-skilled and doing something slightly more efficiently than I can do already.
To a hospital, there are expert systems that sit there, and when the doctor keys in the order, it looks through the sort of
But it's not de-skilling me.
John, are you talking about a computer making decisions for you, making kind of moral judgments for you? You don't want to do those yourself, you want a computer to make those decisions for you.
You're jumping from decision to moral judgment. Now, a
I don't see the great difference between the two things
often.
There's
a huge difference. You trust your calculator.
If I make a decision whether or not to kind of drive very fast, I may kill someone. I mean, that's the decision. What's the difference?
People are conflating, all of us, I think. Well, not me, but I think everyone else here. It's confusing. It's confusing the issue. Sheila's talking about her mind. Now, the mind is not the same as simply memorizing a fact. That is a big difference, yeah? Now, of course, we can discuss what the mind is and what the personality, what the consciousness is. That is not the same as a driving skill. I would personally welcome, I'm a lousy driver, I would welcome something that freed up the rest of my brain. At the moment, I'm still at the poor driving stage when I have to concentrate very hard on what I do with my limbs in relation to coloured lights and so on. If this was done automatically for me, I'd be marvellously grateful.
Yeah, well, human nature, people are people. If you're going to be a rotten driver, you'll be a rotten driver with 15 chips. I mean, people who are going to be good drivers are good drivers the minute they get into cars. I think the point about Paul Gascoigne is well taken. But just to go back to John's point about how they get into your brain, do you honestly want to leave a piece of your brain on the operating floor so that you can have this damn chip in? You know, I remember Frank Muir saying that even to remember somebody's phone number now, he had to displace a poem he'd learned at school. And, you know, who wants to do that?
The brain doesn't work like that. It simply does not work like that. You don't have bits replacing other bits.
Sheila, can you not see any advantage in all this? Can you see only grimness and some sort of grisly, futuristic hell?
I could have been seduced into bits of it until I discovered that the two experts here are actually fundamentally disagreeing with each other, which worries me enormously. I mean, John's telling... Yeah, just for a change. John tells me this is only going to give me information, it's not going to give me skills. Susan expects it to give her skills. Frankly, if they can bend my mind that much, then I'm now an opponent.
Well, John?
I can't imagine, both technically or indeed in the sense of why would I want to buy that, something that changes my personality. I am firmly me. I read a book, I take on board other people's memories, but they remain other people's memories. I can't technically see how you would build something that infiltrated your personality, nor can I see why I'd want to buy it.
But if you can be actually effectively with another person's experience in your brain, you can be that other person. You can have every single perspective of what they've actually experienced.
No more than you could now be Madonna, Michael. I mean, you know, the surgery I'm sure would help.
Psychological research clearly shows that it doesn't matter what kind of quality of mind have, the attractive get promoted in every field. Mind and body quite connected, says the Chinese sage. Take a look. You know, so, and we're talking about mind as if it's some kind of thing that we can already take out like a golf ball. And it's all a complete continuum for most ordinary people, and the inequalities of people will continue.
But the future may be full of risks as we become increasingly dependent on technology, which, as you know, can always let us down.
February 2110.
I'm waiting to hear now, but they don't sound hopeful. There was an accident, a screw-up with electrostatic fields at the skyport. It completely wiped my discs. I've lost everything. They're trying to retrieve it now, bit by bit, but the cochlear implant was insured. A replacement will be here tomorrow. I can go back to work, and they've loaned me a generic experience disc, so I can function. That's not the problem. The problem is, I don't remember who the woman in the next room is. I mean, I know who it is. It's Alice. But apparently we've been married 84 years. We've got kids. I don't remember them at all. I don't even remember me. It's like I handed everything over to the chips for so long that I never changed, never learnt anything. It's like being stranded decades in the past with no way of coming home. Unless they can fix a memory chip that cost 100 marks. You'd think a whole life would be worth more than that, wouldn't you?
But this is the real problem, the real risk. What we're substituting for personality, humanity, we're substituting that with technology. So shouldn't we have drawn the line way before we reached that sort of period, Sheila?
Well, I was just thinking, watching that film, that I hope if he was at the skyport that he was the check-in clerk and not the pilot, because, you know, because I'm not getting on that, whatever it is. It's not so much a question of drawing lines. I don't think it's quite that straightforward. I think, however, we do have to ask ourselves what we're looking for, why we're looking for it, and what are the consequences of finding it. And only when we're sophisticated enough to answer that kind of question should we progress. And that's not kind of Luddite, it's actually just saying take it easy.
But isn't the case all along with all these kind of discussions, the fact that technology is leaping ahead of you people mulling over what the consequences might be?
Well, I mean, that's one of the problems, of course, and it's a good reason for saying that we should stop the boffins and get them to engage with us in discussion, just like Susan is about to do now, rather than waiting until they've done it. Over to you, Susan.
Go on.
I was about to say, for once, amazingly, I agreed with the first half of what you said. Not the second half, but the first half at least I agreed with, which was we should ask what we're doing, what questions are we asking, what are we after. Unlike you, I wouldn't stop. That shouldn't be a reason for stopping. But I think we should be very clear about our motives here and what we're doing. I agree with you, there's no clear, simple little line to draw, but we ought to have our goals clear. Because, I mean, even a scientist would do that. No scientist goes into a lab and doesn't have their goals clear, doesn't have a clear question.
There's actually no justification for this at all for people who are not ill or have not suffered memory loss. Because people, contrary to the film, people do not forget the important things. Unless this man is brain damaged, he would not forget his children. Everybody remembers their first date, their first car, their first job, their mother's maiden name, as security officials will ask you. That is what people do not forget, and ordinary, normal people do not need these things.
But surely the whole point about this film, John, is that we've reached a stage where people do that their personalities are overtaken by technology. Technology, because it has helped them, has replaced it.
It's one of the rules of nature. In the Middle Ages, they used to get anxious about the Black Death and religious tensions in the 16th century. Anxious people get anxious.
These are
John.
tools. I mean, we use them to satisfy our own needs and goals. We don't use things that bore us or that are useless. We use things that make us happy.
Like
And you're saying that human beings' tools have never destroyed him?
But I part company with the film, particularly, with the idea that it's somehow subtracting parts of this man's personality and, you know, stealing them away into the ether.
Peter?
I mean, he seems terribly miserable, really, doesn't he? This enormous drive of technology and the wonders of science have made an incredibly miserable man. I mean, should science and technology not be a kind of therapeutic thing? Should it not be helping us?
Well,
I mean,
I think
Hang on a second. Do you find that convincing? Do you find his tortured look convincing after a century, what did you say, 2115 or something, after more than a century of technology meant to make his life easier, happier, and more fruitful?
I'd be deeply depressed if basically my entire kind of memory and personality and all ideas of creativity and imagination and everything about me had been taken away on some kind of chip, and the only way I could have it back would be to kind of put the chip back in. I mean, I'd rather be dead. There's nothing of me there.
But that's an illogical statement, and I think the problem...
Well,
I think the fallacy...
It's an emotional
because
subject.
the fallacy that he makes as well. He talks about him, I, as if the rest of his brain is separate from the concept of self. Whereas the brain constitutes yourself. That's it. You are it, and it is you. You can't divorce the two. You can't stand back and say, I want this and I want that, but I've given away my memories.
But surely by tampering with the brain, if you say these two things are so intimately linked, surely by tampering with the brain, you tamper with our idea of self at the same time. You can't avoid it, and you can't avoid either taking something away or adding something to it. And I would see that as unnatural, basically.
But John, that's the point, isn't it? Isn't memory actually part of what you are?
I'd make 2 points there. I mean, again, we're talking gradations along a long, steady stream that starts
and this is
today.
the furthest end.
We lose our books, we lose our possessions, we somehow feel diminished in a way.
John,
but, you know, and so what we're talking about is just making access to those richer, deeper, fuller. The other thing that technology does offer you, though, is just a practical good, is, you know, we can back this stuff up. We can make copies. And the other point where I thought the film sort of lost reality completely was, why didn't they just back this man up? They can make memories right, left, and center for 100 marks, you know?
In the back,
There is no technology yet devised which can separate the mind from far stronger drives of the human emotion, and the deep psychological drives, particularly the subconscious ones, will always come out sometime, somewhere. So you can program it till you like.
I mean, you know, if we really don't want, you know, electronic stuff to change people's minds, we should all stop talking now.
But we have a choice when we sit and watch television in simulating the information. We can believe it or not believe it. It seems to me with these things bolted onto us, we have no choice. They're just bolted into us.
But hang on a second, I've had two particular things that have struck me as I've been watching Michael Marshall Smith's films. The first is I'm thinking of Stephen Hawking. I mean, there is a man who's just a brain, really, yet, you know, I mean, his body doesn't work, his voice doesn't even work, and yet there is a personality, a human spirit that survived, on the one hand. On the other hand, I look at Michael Marshall Smith being all tortured, and I think, well, that's right, isn't it? I mean, all these developments we've had so far have made us more tortured. The mobile phone has just made us more controlled by our employers or our families, and think, oh, come on!
Also, the greatest single psychological problem that individuals face today is alienation. Not from each other. We have in some ways a stronger sense of community in the international community and the net and all that, but alienation from themselves, from their own real experience, their sense of themselves. And these chip things can only advance that process.
But Sheila, do you not think that? Do you not think that all this technology is really crowding in on us and narrowing our experience, and narrowing the nature of our personalities?
I think it's certainly causing additional anxieties. Whether it's narrowing our experience, I'm not so sure, but I now dread going into the office because I've got email, and everybody seems to find it so user-friendly that they'll tell me if they're going out of the office for half an hour, and I really didn't need to know that. So I think it's the same question with all technologies, no matter what you're doing. What's it for? Does it serve a useful purpose? And before we go any further with it, we should answer those questions.
But what were these marvellous experiences then? What were these marvellous experiences that we were having pre-technology? These marvellous experiences were dying early, of being cold, of having to do a lot of manual labour.
No, that's nothing to do with
that's nothing to do with technology, of course. Oh, no, so you're picking your technologies now, are you?
Well, I mean, you know, wood and a little matches and this sort of thing.
Okay, fine, well, that's what we're advocating. We're not saying that all technology... I'm not saying that all technology is universally utopian and marvellous. Of course we have to exercise judgment. Don't think we don't. But you can't just write off technology.
My greatest consolation is...
because we can email, we're not going to go on walks, or we're not going to meet people and talk to them.
We're not going to fall in love.
You look at need
My greatest consolation is
reflect.
that none of these
Wonderful.
technologies ever turns out as wonderful as it was advanced. I mean, everything from silent film to broadcasting to the wheel, probably, in the Middle Ages. Some guy probably said, look at this, chaps, it's going to advance civilization. And everyone went, oh, yeah. I mean, everything is cracked up to be more than it is. And I think that in the end, most people will actually just not access it, to use the jargon.
Could I bring this to some sort of close by asking you, if you looked at Michael Marshall Smith's 3 films, which took us through drugs, through computer headsets to memory chips, and you were able to say, I can put up with that much, but it was really wrong to go that much further, where would you draw the line, Peter, before we started?
No, I mean, one of my abiding ambitions is to learn to play the piano. And I can read the music with my eyes. I can't make my fingers do the right thing. So perhaps this chip might help me with that. So I'd be prepared, perhaps, for very small things. But fundamentally, I object to the idea of interfering with nature in that sense, interfering with our personalities, interfering with what one we might see as sort of God-given personality. I really would draw the line right at the beginning.
Sheila.
I think I would, in the short term, wait until I was convinced that there was that we'd solved the therapeutic needs before we got into anything which was actually, if you like, a luxury in our lives. And at that stage, I think what we would want to do then is to say, well, do we need, deserve, or want this luxury, or are there other luxuries or other things we'd rather have?
So you think that's a line that could possibly be drawn?
I don't see why not. And if it isn't a line we can draw, then we're extremely unsophisticated intellectually.
All the way with Susan?
I don't think we have fixed personalities anyway. I think we're in a constant state of flux and change, and this is just enhancing those influences. It's just making more of what life does to us anyway.
John?
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Peter, but it's going to make me draw the line at the end rather than the beginning. I think the key thing is my sense of self and my personality, and where the great opportunity that I see with all of these things is it enhances my sense of self. It gives me all these new experiences to test myself against, to see if I like or not. It gives me new ideas to argue with, whole new worlds to get into dialogue with. Where I draw the line, though, is when it starts to undermine or overwhelm my sense of self, when I start to plug in the chips and just have the equivalent of brain static. Oh God, all of these facts, what do I do now?
Rosalind.
It's wonderfully attractive to think of being able to play the piano or speak, as it were, more Spanish than just hasta la vista. But I think that's just like the wannabe in all of us. I think the human mind and memory as we have it is marvelous, and it's still an undiscovered continent. We could do so much more with what we've got. And I firmly believe it should be restricted to people who've suffered memory damage or memory loss. It should be used therapeutically and for no other reason.
That's it for this week. Program into your memory chips, Futurewatch next week, when we'll be talking about sex.